Let us first take a look at the text. Let us first take a look at the text and see why what I've just given you, this very special gift that I've just given you, is important. We're on page 314 in the KUZARI, and we're up to paragraph 22, where the KUZARI said, in response to hearing how a pious Jew used to behave when we were living in Yerushalayim in the presence of the temple and the Shekhinah was part of our everyday living, he says, the KUZARI said, this is the ultimate level. The only thing higher is the level of angels. One who was so well equipped could rightfully hope to achieve prophecy, especially because of the habitation of the divine presence. And you remember that according to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, a Jew can only achieve prophecy inside the land of Israel or because of the land of Israel, for the simple reason is that you need the Shekhinah, you need the divine presence to be imminent in order to have a prophetic experience. This is not agreed to by everyone, but that's a discussion of prophecy that we've talked about extensively in the past, and maybe we'll come back to it later. But it's only mentioned incidentally over here. The type of service you have described did not require any additional asceticism or abstinence. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi has alluded to this in other places in the KUZARI. I'm going to move back a little bit, it'll be a little closer to you, where he talked about the idea that there are other religious traditions that emphasize asceticism, whereas Judaism doesn't emphasize asceticism. Judaism emphasizes living here in the here and now and enjoying life while in the process of serving Hashem. The reason why Judaism does not emphasize asceticism is because we acknowledge that as much as Hashem created us with a soul, He also created us with bodies, and He wants our bodies to be part of the divine service. He wants our bodies to do mitzvot. He wants our bodies to indulge in the physical world in the service of the Creator. Asceticism is essentially a rejection of that which is physical, corporeal, as something that only detracts and does not enhance our service of Hashem. Now, why is this important to the current discussion that we're about to embark upon? Because as we are going to see, in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's time, he was at the tail end of a holy war that was existing within Judaism. Remember, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi lives in the early 12th century, late 11th century, early 12th century, and he is a product of his times, and he has to perforce react to the greatest threats to Judaism. That's really why he wrote the KUZARI. Up until now, what have been the greatest threats to Judaism that we've seen? Anyone remember? What are the greatest threats to Judaism for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi? If we were to put the top one on the top of the chart, for the Jewish community where he's living, what's the greatest threat to Judaism? Anyone remember? It's philosophy. It's the philosophy of Muslim society who have adopted Greek philosophy as almost their scholastic banner, and it is something that instills the parent society in which Rabbi Yehuda Halevi lives a great sense of pride and a sense of superiority, and there's a condescension that Jews feel that we are maintaining this primitive form of religious devotion that is not contemporary. It is not keeping up with the religion of the larger society in the Muslim world, where everyone is very enlightened and everyone feels that they are intellectually advanced because Islam has adopted philosophy as part of its faith, and Judaism is still stuck back in the Stone Age. That was the prevailing attitude. The second ideological war that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is engaged in is something that we're about to see now. It is not an external threat of the parent culture, but it is rather an internal threat through schismatic or sectarian Jews. There's a large sect of Jews in his time. Again, we're coming at the tail end of this threat in the 12th century, but it's nonetheless present, and it is the threat of the Karaites. Now, there is a lot that you should already know about Karaism, but we're going to learn a lot more about it today. What do you know about Karaism today? There's one chapter in Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of the Jewish Law, that instituted a halacha specifically to go against the Karaites. And you're all very, very, very familiar with this halacha.
Having cholent on Shabbos?
Having cholent on Shabbos. That's exactly right. The reason why we have hamim or chunt on Shabbos, or cholent on Shabbos, is because we want to demonstrate that we are not Karaites. Now, what was the origin? Because the Karaites believed that when the Torah says, Lo tevaru eish b'chol moshvotechem b'yom haShabbat, you may not burn a fire in all of your dwelling places on the Sabbath day, they were biblical literalists, and this was the major schism between Rabbinic Judaism and Karaism, is that the Karaites took the biblical text much more literally, and if the Torah therefore stated you cannot have fire burning on the Sabbath day, they understood that to mean that there can be no fires burning in your house on the Sabbath. And therefore there's no hot food, there's no fuel burning, there's no lights, there is nothing having to do with fire in your home on the Shabbat. It's a very austere way of spending Shabbos in the darkness and without any heat and without any hot food. But that's the way they understood it. And our medieval sages said, in order to demonstrate that you're not a Karaite, it is a mitzvah, like a rabbinic mitzvah, to have hot food on Shabbos day to show that we believe in the rabbinic tradition that says you cannot start a fire on Shabbat, but if you have a fire that's already burning from before Shabbos and you've put the food up and it continues cooking, it's perfectly fine to have hot food. Now, that does not mean that there is a mitzvah to have fatty meat and kishka on Shabbos morning. It doesn't even mean that you have to have what we call cholent. If you want to have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, you also fulfill that halacha, because a Karaite could not have a hot cup of coffee on Shabbos morning either. We're going to do a series next month on Hilchot Shabbat, and we'll talk about the laws of Bishul, we'll talk about the laws of Shehiyah and Chazara, and so forth, having to do with dealing with hot or heated foods on Shabbos. But for now, that's the most famous thing about the Karaites. Now, I acquired this book a number of years ago when I was in university doing some of my studies, and what did I do? Okay, and in the course of my studies, I was studying a little bit about the Karaites. I came across this book called the Karaite Anthology by Leon Nimoy. Not Leonard Nimoy. Karaites do not have pointy ears. But Leon Nimoy, who was a great scholastic, was a professor at Yale University, and in 1952, he published his magnum opus on Karaism, and he basically put together a series of texts that were unearthed through archaeological studies, through the Geniza, through a lot of other sources, the Cairo Geniza, to be able to put together some texts that the Karaites held by as their sacred writings, and teaching them what the laws of Karaism are and so forth. Now, I want us to go through a very brief history of the Karaites. We're not going to read the whole text today. We're going to read maybe a third of the text. But this is and the reason why I told you at the beginning this is a great gift I'm giving you is because you have presented to you in this introduction a history, not only of Karaism, but of Rabbinic Judaism, beginning from the times of the Mishnah until the medieval period, which is sometimes difficult for us to get our heads around. So you're going to thank me one day, either today or some other time in the future, just by giving you this piece of information. Let's start reading it, and we're going to skip around as I'll show you. The introduction is, the Arab conquests of the 7th century rapidly consolidated into a far-flung empire, brought nearly all Jewish centers of that period under the control and influence of Islam. The most important of these centers of medieval Jewry, the mainspring of Jewish learning, culture, and authority, had long since been anchored in Iraq, the ancient Babylonia. Now, this goes back even before the advent of Islam, as you know. Now, this metropolitan Jewish community was to embark upon a new and eventful era of its long history, an era of remarkable accomplishment as well as fateful strife. And what he's describing is the Jewish community in Bavel, in Iraq, in the 7th and 8th centuries. We're going to get to that very shortly. But first, let's go back a little bit earlier in time to the 6th century. The Jewish settlement in Iraq traced its origin as far back as the Babylonian exile, even much earlier, 586 BCE. Right, so we're going 10 centuries back. Under the Persian rule of the Parthian and Sassanid dynasties, it developed an autonomous system of self-government headed by the Exilarch. How do we say Exilarch in Aramaic? The Reish Galuta. The Reish Galuta was a designated head of the Babylonian community that existed for centuries. And the way it's described is, he served as the chief representative of Jewry before the king and was responsible for the collection of taxes, the administration of justice, and the maintenance of public order and safety within the Jewish community. To assist him in these administrative functions, he had under his control an extensive bureaucracy of officials whose salaries and expenses, like his own, were paid out of special taxes imposed upon the Jewish population over and above the regular levies payable to the Persian state. This sounds a little bit foreign to us, to live in the diaspora and to be taxed by the Jewish community. This was done, by the way, in many Jewish communities in Europe before we moved to the Western Hemisphere. There was even a Russian word for a meat tax that was imposed upon the Jewish community. Basically, it was like something like a penny per pound that was done in Russia, and this was what funded the Jewish community. We don't have those things anymore today. But you know what they called that tax in Russian? They called it the Korobka, and that's how I know about it, because my name is a derivative of that tax. The word Korobka in Russian just means a box. It's a collection box. So, but that was the name of the tax. What happened is that when Jews immigrated to the United States, there was a chief in the early 1900s, in the first decade of the 1900s, literally about 110 years ago, Rav Yaakov Yosef was elected as the chief rabbi of New York, and by default, the chief rabbi of the United States. And the question is, why don't we have a chief rabbi of the United States anymore? We have a chief rabbi of the UK, we have a chief rabbi of South Africa. What happened to the chief rabbi of the United States? It was because he tried to impose a meat tax that the Hungarians and the Lithuanians and the Russians, the Jews, this was a melting pot. You could no longer apply the standards of communal taxation in the way that it was done in the Shtetl in Europe. The Jews who came to the Goldene Medina said, no, we don't have to conform to any one specific authority, and that it broke the back of the chief rabbinate. And since the 1910s, we have not had a chief rabbinate in the United States, nor by extension, for that matter, in Canada either. So that may be a good thing in your opinion, it may be a bad thing, but the concept of a community tax was something that was known in the ancient world, going back, especially in the diaspora, going back to the Babylonian period, and the Jews therefore had to experience double taxation. The first taxation was by the Persian authorities. The second taxation was by the Jewish authorities. You had to fund the office of the Reish Galuta and all of the Jewish infrastructure of the community. One of the most famous sages of the Talmud was the house rabbi of the Exilarch. His name was Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman appears throughout the Talmud, Talmud Bavli, but he was also known as the hired rabbinic authority of the Reish Galuta, which made some of his statements suspect by some of his colleagues because he worked for the Reish Galuta. That's not for now, that's for later. Let's continue. Although some of the exilarchs were competent scholars in theology and law, the exilarchate in itself was essentially a political office and carried no duties and powers in the field of religion and legal theory. This was the province of the rabbinical academies, especially of the two major seats of learning in the cities of Sura and Pumbedita. We're talking now somewhere around the 3rd, 4th centuries of the Common Era. Sura and Pumbedita become the Ascendant Academies of Torah study. During the Persian period, these were scholastic institutions, pure and simple, whose curriculum covered the Bible, the oral tradition, developed an explanation of the biblical legislation, and codified in written form about 200 of the Common Era as the Mishnah, and the auxiliary disciplines necessary in dealing with various special branches of law. So he's giving us a history of the oral tradition, the Torah Sheba'al Peh. It is formalized in around 200 of the Common Era, and you have the academies of Sura and Pumbedita in Bavel. The Mishnah is not finalized in Bavel. It's finalized in Palestine, in Eretz Yisrael. But the academies of Sura and Pumbedita, which become ascendant after the period of the Mishnah, start to analyze the Mishnaic text. The result of the research and teaching done at these academies was a vast body of new oral tradition built up in the exposition and elaboration of the Mishnah, and to provide for new conditions and new situations that had not been covered in the biblical and Mishnaic legislation. With the progressive decline of the Persian state, it became imperative to re-examine this mass of oral law and custom and eventually reduce it to writing in order to ensure its preservation for the future. Begun in the second half of the 4th century, this sifting was continued slowly and carefully for over 100 years, until about 500 of the Common Era, when it culminated in the publication of the encyclopedic thesaurus known as the Babylonian Talmud, which became the mainstay of Jewish life and social order. This highly developed system of self-government and scholarly activity was based upon a social and economic structure no less complex. The social stratification produced an upper class, represented by the governmental bureaucracy, the upper layer of the intelligentsia, that's the rabbis, and the wealthy landowners, bankers, and merchants, a middle class, including the lower layer of intellectuals, and the Amei Haaretz, the great mass of rural tenant farmers and urban artisans and laborers. The lot of the latter class was far from easy under the heavy burden of double taxation, high land rentals and interest charges, and frequent ravages of foreign and civil wars. The political and economic decay of the Persian Empire during the 6th and 7th centuries intensified the misery of this major component of the Jewish community and produced in many minds a conviction that their situation was desperate and could not be endured very much longer. So whenever you get into economic austerity, you get civil unrest, you get dissatisfaction with the status quo, and this now begins the rise of schisms that arise within the Jewish community. You're with us so far in the history. This is now we're post-Talmud, 6th and 7th centuries in Iraq and Bavel. A certain level of civil unrest is developing because of financial pressures and other kinds of hardships. The new Arab overlords who replaced the Persian rulers in the middle of the 7th century left Jewish autonomy, and this is the advent of Islam, right? Left Jewish autonomy in Iraq practically undisturbed, and the exilarch continued to function as the chief magistrate of the Jewish community and its representative at the caliph's court. The prestige of the office, however, gradually declined. At the same time, the influence of the two major academies increased correspondingly. Their presidents now assumed the title of Gaon. So the head of the exile, the exilarch, declines. The academies increase in power, and now the seat of power is no longer the Reish Galuta, but it is now the Gaonim. The Gaonim are like the Rosh Yeshiva of the academies. And together with their faculties, they became the chief legislative organs and the highest courts of appeal for the Jewish population, thus acquiring a separate corps of public officials whose salaries added another charge upon the communal treasury. So again, the yeshivas are placing a financial burden upon the rest of the community, again, creating civil unrest. Although few of the Gaonim were truly outstanding personalities in the way of creative thought, their imprint upon Jewish life was most profound and lasting, for they applied the finishing touches to the recognition of Talmudic law as the guiding rule of Jewish religious and social life. We're going to skip here, and basically the transition between Persian and Arab rule, the financial burdens, the civil unrest, the constant ransacking of farms by foreign marauders and invaders, creates a certain unrest among the Jewish population, and many of them decide to migrate to outlying regions of the Arab Empire. This gives them a greater sense of autonomy, and it allows for further schisms to arise within the Jewish community. So you see how Nimoy is setting up the historical fertile ground for the creation of a new sect of Judaism to arise. Let's go on. Skip to page 16, first paragraph. All these influences, by their combined action, produced at a very early date the principles common to a large number of schismatic movements, which eventually, through a long process of elimination and consolidation, formed the Karaite sect. First, and he tells us what the factors were to form the Karaite sect. First, the rejection of the validity of the Talmud, whose adherents were now called Rabbinites, i.e. partisans of the Talmudic rabbis and their successors. So you see, there's a natural resentment based on financial pressures of the academies of rabbinic tradition. Okay, that's number one. Second, he says, that this inclination, inspired no doubt by their grievances against the Iraqi religious and secular officials, to recognize the permanent authority of a religious leader or of a succession of leaders, and the insistence on the freedom of each individual to interpret the Bible, the sole repository of law, in the light of his own understanding and judgment. So rejection of the oral tradition, which is, again, under the purview of the rabbis. Third, a perfervid messianic nationalism, impatient of the seemingly endless delay in the redemption and restoration of Israel. Fourth, a strong flavor of unworldly asceticism. Notice the connection to what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi has talked about, that a pious Jew doesn't need to be an ascetic. Immediately preceding his discussion of Karaites. Now you understand the connection. Okay? Because the Karaites were known for their fervent asceticism, at least some of them were. And fifth, an acute sense of social justice and opposition to economic inequality and oppression, which is what socialism is to the extreme, which again is what happens when there's civil unrest and people feel that there's inequity and unfairness in society. They want to help everybody, okay? So that's another motivating factor of this schism called Karaism. Next paragraph. The passage of time and the harsh necessities of reality eventually forced upon Karaism a modification of these principles. While the Talmud remained theoretically outlawed, much Talmudic material was quietly incorporated into Karaite practice of law and custom. We're going to see this in the KUZARI as well. Because it is literally impossible to rely solely on biblical texts to guide you in law. So the Karaites had to fill in the blanks. So they filled in the blanks with some of their own innovation, and they filled in the blanks surreptitiously using Talmudic law without attributing it to Talmudic law, because they wanted to make it clear that we are not recognizing the Talmud at all. Okay? But a purely Karaite tradition was developed and recognized as well. The anarchy of individual interpretation of the Bible was softened to some extent by partial recognition of the authority of outstanding Karaite scholars. The ascetic tendency was gradually reduced, and the passionate longing for Zion was diverted into the channel of prayer and pious hope. Finally, the distaste for riches and those who possess them was overcome by the rise of a native Karaite aristocracy and wealthy bourgeois, which is always what happens in socialist societies. Okay, next paragraph. To distinguish themselves from the Rabbinites, the new sectarians assumed the name of Karaites, or Karaim, a term which first appears in the 9th century. The most natural rendering of it is champions of Scripture, Kara, which is Scripture, who do not recognize the post-biblical oral tradition, from the Hebrew kara, to read, specifically to read and study Scripture, mikra. Another explanation derives the term from the alternate meaning of kara, which is to call or to invite. Hence, Karaites would signify callers or missionaries, similar to the Shiite callers, the da'i, who exhorted Muslims to join their movement. So, in the sense, the word Karaite could also mean a missionizer, a missionary. A third interpretation connects the name with the Arabic kara, expert reader in Scripture, alluding to the Karaite preoccupation with biblical exegesis. All these derivations, however, are more or less conjectural and have no documentary evidence to support them. Let us continue. We're going to skip now to on page 18, okay? He goes through some of the history of the original leaders of Karaism. Ovadia is the name of one of the original Karaites who sort of tries to consolidate Karaism. And if you look at the second half of the page, on page 18, in the middle of the paragraph it says, the honor of supplying a pioneer manual of non-rabbinite theology fell to a learned and cultured Iraqi of aristocratic rabbinite descent named Anan ben David, who flourished in the 7th decade of the 8th century. How he came to break with the faith of his fathers we do not know, but it seems certain that it was not the result of angry disappointment over the failure of his candidacy for the office of exilarch, as the traditional rabbinite account would have it. In any case, his secession from rabbinism marks the first known evidence of Karaite penetration into the metropolitan Jewish center of Iraq, and his code of law is the earliest extant Karaite literary document. It earned for him a hazy sort of prestige among the other sectarians, while later Karaism elevated him to the dignity of the father of its synagogue and honored his lineal descendants with the title of Nasi, or prince. But in actual fact, his teaching, permeated by a strong spirit of monastic asceticism, attracted few adherents and was often sharply criticized by other schismatics. So what you see from here is that the Karaites do not have their act together. There's a few people who follow this guy, a few people who follow this guy, and they're all just very loosely connected in the 7th and 8th centuries because of their united disdain for the rabbinic world, for the Talmud and the rabbinic community. Skip now to page 19, just a few lines from the bottom. The Karaite communities remain small and poor compared with their rabbinite counterparts, and it is significant that with the exception of Anan, not a single early Karaite scholar is stated to have been a rabbinite convert. The reason is not far to seek. The rigorous and ascetic aspect of Karaite practice could have had little attraction for the poverty-stricken Jewish masses, whose life was already full of privation and self-denial, while the rabbinite intellectuals were repelled by the chaotic condition of Karaism, even as late as the second quarter of the 10th century. There was as yet no such thing as a unified Karaite sect, rather a mass of quarreling schismatics among whom, as a contemporary Karaite author pointedly expressed it, it was impossible to find two individuals in complete agreement with one another. And that's usually what happens when people are schismatic, when they break away from the mainstream. They're united by their desire to rebel, but like, Korach and his people were united against Moshe, but they also had internal disagreements within themselves. Okay, very interesting so far. Now we get to a historical turning point of the Karaites, which happens in the late 10th century, early 11th century. Okay, and the turning point has to do with the strategy of one great rabbinic leader by the name of Saadia Gaon. Rabbi Saadia Gaon decided that he was going to take on, if we could ask someone to turn off their phone, please. That's okay. Okay, Saadia Gaon is the leader of the Jewish community in Bavel. He is one of the most distinguished Gaonim in Jewish history, arguably the most distinguished Gaon in Jewish history. Remember, the period of the Gaonim starts around the 7th century and goes until around the 11th century. Okay, and so Reb Saadia Gaon is one of the last Gaonim, but he is also the Gaon who makes the most important and institutional changes to enable Judaism to move forward to medieval Judaism, which would eventually migrate largely to Europe. Reb Saadia Gaon marks the end of the period of the Gaonim, but also the one who sort of lays the groundwork to allow Jews to migrate to Europe and to continue Judaism as a complete continuation of the project that had commenced in Bavel. Okay? So Reb Saadia Gaon views the Karaites as a danger, as an existential threat to Judaism, whereas other people poo-pooed the Karaites and said, just ignore them. They're so disorganized. Nothing's going to become of them. If you ignore them, they'll go away. And Rabbi Saadia took a decidedly different strategy, and he felt that if we don't say anything, they will eventually infiltrate our ranks, and they will corrode traditional Judaism, the rabbinic Judaism. They will corrode it and corrupt it. So let's see what he does. The stimulus to put an end to this chaos and introduce some semblance of organized unity was supplied to the Karaites not by one of their own number, but by a rabbinite scholar, the famous Saadia ben Yosef al-Fayumi, Gaon of the Academy at Sura in Bavel. Up to this time, the Karaites had succeeded in maintaining an amicable relationship with their rabbinite neighbors, and the failure of the schismatics to gain any appreciable numbers of converts encouraged the rabbinite authorities in their belief that the wisest, as well as the easiest course, was to leave them alone. This Fabian policy, what he means by Fabian policy, is just sort of like gradually just ignore them and eventually they'll go away, of his predecessors found no favor at all in the eyes of Saadia. A man of immense learning and pioneering intellect, as well as of profound piety and moral rectitude, he was at the same time human enough to be impatient and strong-willed toward those who disagreed with him. The peaceful intercourse between Orthodox rabbinites and Karaite schismatics appeared to him to be an intolerable and dangerous thing. In a series of polemical tracts, Saadia proceeded to attack and refute the doctrine and practice of Karaism and to demonstrate to his own satisfaction that the Karaites were not just harmless deviators to be mildly chided for their error, but complete apostates, like total apikorsim, heretics, who should be ostracized from the community of Israel. It's one of the reasons why he wrote his arguably one of his most famous works, called Emunot V'Deot, of Rabbi Saadia Gaon, the book of faith and knowledge, to be able to delineate what is necessary dogmatically or doctrinally for a Jew to believe. It was really an attack, it was a polemic against the Karaites. The suddenness of his attack and its effectiveness, owing to Saadia's great prestige in bringing about a complete break between Rabbinites and Karaites, horrified the latter, since they believed, no doubt quite sincerely, that they had done nothing to provoke so crushing a blow. By analogy, just by analogy, in the mid-20th century, conservative Judaism was perceived by many Roshei Yeshiva, many Gedolei Yisrael, as a threat to Orthodox Judaism, because it in many ways presented itself like Reform Judaism. People by and large understood it wasn't a threat anymore by the middle 20th century because it was so different from Orthodoxy that it was clearly recognizable as not having any semblance of acceptability to Orthodox Judaism. But conservative Judaism at the time was very similar. Really very, very subtle differences existed in the 40s and 50s, such as there was maybe separate seating but no mechitza. And in an Orthodox shul, there was separate seating and a mechitza. And the davening was the same. Halachic observance was largely the same, except there was more tolerance in the conservative synagogues for people who drove to shul, even though there were not until maybe the 60s did they come up with an actual tshuva, giving permission to people to drive to shul on Shabbat in the conservative movement. But the fact is that there was a perception that conservative Judaism was a real threat because it was so similar. And that's why certain takanot were made by the Roshei Yeshiva of that time, saying that a Jew should not enter into a conservative shul, should not have anything to do with conservative Jews, and so forth and so on. Now, that was a strategy. It was a correct strategy for its time, and Reb Saadia perceived that there were certain things that were starting to creep in from the Karaites, even though his other contemporaries said, leave them alone. They're disheveled, they're disorganized, nothing's going to happen. But he felt, no, we have to take a decisive stand of dividing Rabbinites and Karaites, and therefore it had a very interesting after effect. It galvanized the Karaites to get their act together. Because basically, up until then, they were a ragtag group of people who just knew that they weren't rabbinic. But now they said, well, if he's going to reject us and we have no attachment at all to the rabbinic community whatsoever, we really have to get ourselves together and unify so that we have something that we stand for as a unified sect of Judaism. And that's how Karaite Judaism became actually somewhat stronger as a result of the attacks of Reb Saadia Gaon. Moreover, their forced estrangement from the Rabbinite community meant the closing of the only missionary field open to them and the collapse of the hope that their teaching would ultimately be accepted by all of Jewry. It was only natural, therefore, that they came to regard Saadia as their principal enemy, and that their writings are full of counterattacks against him, often phrased in terms surcharged with passionate resentment. Saadia's attack, however, also had important beneficial consequences for the Karaites. It contributed decisively to the consolidation of the quarreling schismatic groups into a more or less organized sect, and it forced Karaism, for the sake of sheer survival, to purge itself in some measure of the excessive rigorism and pedantry inspired by Anan and others of the same uncompromising attitude. Furthermore, the necessity of meeting Saadia's arguments on his own high level of theological, philosophical, and philological erudition produced a series of very able Karaite scholars whose works, written in Arabic or Hebrew, marked the golden age of Karaite literary production, which is circa years 900 to 1200. Remember, when is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi writing the Kuzari? First half of the 12th century. So it's clear that the Karaites are still in their golden age. They're at the tail end of their golden age, but Karaism is still a threat because they're sort of holding on because of the need for them to consolidate and occupy a valuable place in the common treasury of medieval Jewish literature. Nevertheless, the final cleavage between the two camps sealed the fate of Karaism as far as its future expansion was concerned. The historical raison d'etre of the sect lay in its role as a corrective to the abuses, theological and practical, produced on the one hand by the rabbinite overemphasis of Talmudic studies, and on the other by the ills of the social and economic order in the Jewish center in Iraq. Saada's leadership showed that rabbinism had the seat of reform within itself, and the exclusion of the Karaites from the Jewish community made it impossible for them to participate in this reform and at the same time cut them off from the mainstream of Jewish thought and social progress. Okay, now he goes on and discusses the continued history of the Karaites beyond the Golden Age, which we're not going to look at right now because really for our purposes we wanted to see where does Rebbe Yehuda Halevi come to the Karaites. Questions, comments at this point? Yes, Sharon.
Even today, an Orthodox Jewish person will not go into a conservative synagogue, isn't that right? That's
No, not
what
necessarily.
I was told. Because,
Some.
because some of those Jews do drive on Shabbos to shul.
No. Look, it's one thing to pray in a conservative shul. It's another thing to walk into a conservative shul. If a person goes to a wedding at a conservative shul, which is a glad kosher event, I see no reason to be restrictive. There's nothing wrong with that. That's done everywhere in the world today. You go to New York, you go to Los Angeles, you go to Chicago. There are kosher caterers that cater events in conservative banquet halls. There's nothing wrong with walking into a conservative shul. There are some rabbis that even today will tell you, you should not. But that seems to me not to be the prevailing opinion today. It seems that it's quite clear the division today between Orthodox Judaism and conservative Judaism is so blatantly clear today because conservative Judaism has allowed itself to sort of drift leftward to the point where it is almost almost not clear what the divisions today between conservative and Reform Judaism are. The divisions between Orthodox Judaism and conservative Judaism are very clear. They've never been clearer. And so I don't see any reason for us to feel that they present a threat to Orthodox Judaism.
I'm just asking you because I wanted to have this event at a conservative shul, and I was told that people in the organization who were Orthodox would not come.
There might be some who wouldn't come. There might be some who wouldn't come, but that's not the prevailing feeling today. Yeah. Yes.
Where did that tzedukah and the pollution fit in with all of that?
Ah, very good question. So the Sadducees and the Pharisees are a half of a millennium earlier. Josephus talks about the Sadducees and the Pharisees. These are sects that exist in the Second Temple period. We are talking about the golden age of Karaites from the year 900 to 1200 of the Common Era, at least half of a millennium later. So the Karaites arise as a diaspora movement as a result of the rejection of diaspora rabbinic leadership. The Sadducees arise in the Second Temple period as a result of rejection of oral tradition that exists during the Second Temple period, a much earlier movement.
But it was the same theological divide?
Similar theological divides, but what's interesting, as Nimoy has alluded to, the Sadducees could afford to be a little bit less defined because the rabbinic community during that time, during the Second Temple, were in the process of formulating rabbinic law. It's well before the period of the Mishnah, right? So no one has complete control over a codified way of life in, let's say, the turn of the Common Era. Anyway, so we'll continue our discussion of the Karaites in Mirz Hashem next week. We'll get into the text of the KUZARI. What I wanted to really present to you was sort of the historical background why Rabbi Yehuda Halevi feels that the Karaites present this immense threat. Thank you. Present this immense threat to the Jewish community and why he feels he needs to take them on. Remember, it's already, this Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is living 250 years after Reb Saadia Gaon. There's already, the battle lines have been drawn already. He doesn't have the luxury of basically saying, I'll just ignore the Karaites. Karaites have gotten stronger. They've become more consolidated. They have their own texts. And there are a lot of Jews in where he lives who are starting to question and say, what's wrong with these Karaites? Maybe we can follow them. What's oral tradition all about? And why do we need to follow it? That's where this is coming from. Okay? Yes?
Are they still around?
Are Karaites still around?
Yeah.
There are very, very few. Very, very few. And they're not considered halachically as Jewish for a number of reasons. Number one, because there was a lot of intermarriage and assimilation in Karaite communities in Africa and the Middle East. And also because of the potential of bastardy, because they didn't practice the traditional laws of marriage and divorce according to halacha. So therefore, if your son or daughter falls in love with a Karaite, you should be a little bit wary. Yeah.
Do they consider themselves Jewish?
They do consider themselves Jewish, but they're not accepted as Jews by the mainstream.
And do they consider us Jewish?
I don't know. Perhaps yes, perhaps no. I don't know. But it's sort of like to the victor of history belong the spoils. In other words, it's sort of irrelevant what they consider us because they're largely irrelevant to the narrative of Jewish history.